1847, Germany. The orphan who grew teeth every winter solstice, the Hesse Experiment. The bitter cold of December 1847 froze the air in Hesse, Germany. But for the town of Wiesbaden, there was an even colder mystery, one that would haunt them for generations. A child, abandoned on the doorstep of the local orphanage, arrived under the cloak of a stormy night. No name, no history, no parent in sight. Only the thin bundle wrapped in tattered blankets. The orphanage keeper, Frau Biedermann, was used to the quiet cries of abandoned children. But this one felt different. A chill ran down her spine as she picked up the bundle, the weight of it unnatural for such a small infant. As she unwrapped it, she discovered the child's unusually sharp, snow-white teeth. No one had seen a baby like this before. The town whispered, of course. That was their nature. They had always been a quiet, cautious community. But now, they were unsettled. Mutterings about curses and dark magic filled the streets. But the child, though strange, was innocent. Too innocent to understand the weight of her arrival. The first winter passed without incident. The child grew, but at a slower pace than expected. Her eyes were piercing blue, set in a face too pale for comfort. But it wasn't until the following December that the true horror of her existence began to show itself. Every year, as the winter solstice approached, the child's teeth grew, sharper, longer, more menacing, like something out of an old folk tale. No one knew why, no one could explain it, and no one dared to question it aloud. But behind the closed doors of the orphanage, where only the keeper and a few of her staff dared to tread, something darker was at play. Frau Biedermann could not shake the feeling that there was something more to this child, something unnatural. She would never forget the first time she saw the teeth grow. On the stroke of midnight, the child's mouth opened with a crack that made the air still. A ripple of fear shot through the orphanage, and from that night onward, the girl's teeth grew every winter, without fail. Who was this child? And what was her purpose? The questions seemed endless, and the answers even more elusive. As the child's first few years passed, the world outside the orphanage seemed to forget about the little girl. But the people inside couldn't. They couldn't escape the truth they feared. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. The orphanage sat at the edge of Wiesbaden, a long-forgotten building nestled in a sea of old, brittle trees. From the outside, it seemed like a relic of the past. A crumbling, ivy-covered structure that whispered of neglect. Inside, however, the air was thick with secrets. Frau Biedermann had been running the orphanage for more than 2 decades. A woman of stern demeanor and an unyielding sense of duty. But in those early days, as the child's strange growths began, she found herself questioning everything she had known about her role there. The other children noticed too, as their eyes watched the mysterious orphan with both fear and fascination. They saw her pale skin, her unnaturally sharp teeth, and the way she seemed to stare into the darkness, silent, observant, almost knowing. Yet, despite the growing unease among the staff and children, no one dared to ask too many questions. It was the year 1847, after all, and secrets were often better left buried. The town had its own troubles to deal with, and there was no room for gossip about a strange child in an orphanage that was already on the verge of collapse. But inside the orphanage's crumbling walls, there was something more. A room at the back, locked away from the children, where Frau Biedermann and a select few gathered late at night. The room was always cold, no matter the season, and in the center of it, a large oak table, cluttered with papers, scientific journals, old books filled with strange symbols, and notes scribbled in hurried hand. The orphanage, it turned out, had been chosen for a reason. It wasn't merely a place to house abandoned children. No, it was part of something much darker. A secret experiment, orchestrated by powers beyond Wiesbaden's borders, had chosen the orphanage as its base. And the orphan, with her strange teeth and mysterious origins, was the key to it all. The truth of the experiment was known to only a few, but the details were enough to send shivers down the spine of anyone who dared listen. This child was not just a random abandoned soul. She was part of an experiment designed to understand the limits of the human body. an experiment that had gone horribly wrong. A group of scientists, cloaked in secrecy, had been conducting their research for years, observing the child's strange physical transformation every winter solstice. They believed that the child's teeth were a marker of something far more extraordinary, a possible link to an ancient, forgotten lineage. But what they hadn't anticipated was the toll it would take. Not just on the child, but on the very soul of the orphanage itself. As winter descended once again on the orphanage, the isolation of the building became more palpable. The staff began to feel the weight of something sinister pressing down on them, and whispers of the experiment's true nature began to creep from room to room. Some of the older children had started to act strangely, sleepwalking, talking to shadows, and muttering about the Watchers, but no one could quite put their finger on what was happening. And still, the girl's teeth grew, and with each passing winter, her presence became more unnerving. She was no longer just a mystery to the staff. She was becoming something far more dangerous. What exactly was she? And who were the people behind this experiment, hidden within the very walls of the orphanage? It was the night of the winter solstice, 1848. The clock struck midnight, and for a moment, the entire orphanage seemed to hold its breath. The storm outside rattled the windows, but inside, there was a stillness that felt unnatural. The children slept in their dormitories, unaware of the horror unfolding in the room next door. Frau Biedermann had been checking on the orphan for weeks, preparing herself for what she feared would come. The child had become even more withdrawn, her eyes more hollow, as though something inside her had begun to unravel. It was as if the teeth, sharp, jagged, and far too large for her mouth, were a signal of some terrible transformation. The staff had started to avoid the girl, but Biedermann couldn't help herself. She had to know more. The child, who had been silently rocking herself in the corner of the room, suddenly stopped. Her head snapped up, and her eyes locked onto Biedermann's. There was something unnerving in that gaze, a knowing that no child, especially one of her age, should possess. Frau Biedermann's heart raced. She had seen the teeth before, but now they were different. They weren't just growing, they were shifting. The edges had become more serrated, more defined, as if each tooth was a perfect weapon, honed to slice through anything in its path. With a chilling crack, the first of the teeth broke through the girl's lips. Biedermann's breath caught in her throat. She watched, frozen, as more teeth followed, pushing their way through her gums with a sickening sound. The child's small body trembled, her skin pale and stretched tight over the bones. She didn't scream, didn't cry. She merely stared at Biedermann, her lips parting to reveal the full extent of her transformation. The room was silent except for the soft sound of the girl's breathing, slow and deliberate, as if she were savoring the moment. Her mouth opened wider, and with each passing second, her teeth grew longer, more vicious. The change was unnatural, impossible even, but there was no denying what Biedermann was witnessing. The orphan didn't appear to be in pain. No, the child seemed almost pleased. Her eyes shimmered in the dim candlelight, as though she were preparing for something. Preparing for what, though? Biedermann couldn't bring herself to speak, to move. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the transformation stopped. The child closed her mouth and relaxed, as if nothing had happened. She slumped against the wall, her expression unreadable, her teeth now fully formed. Biedermann, still paralyzed by fear, could barely comprehend what she had just seen. Had it been some sort of nightmare? Or was it a reality she could no longer ignore? The storm raged outside, but inside the orphanage, the silence was deafening. The girl's eyes never left Frau Biedermann, as though waiting for her to speak, to react. But no words came. No explanation existed for what had just happened. The following morning, the child was different, calmer. Somehow, her teeth remained, sharp and gleaming in the pale light of dawn. The staff, though uneasy, said nothing. What could they say? They had all witnessed the impossible. And then there were the others. The children in the orphanage began to speak of strange things. Things they'd seen in the night. Things they didn't understand. Some of them spoke of shadows that moved on their own, of whispers in the dark, of the girl who never seemed to sleep. But the most disturbing part of all was the child's growing sense of power. It was as if, with each passing year, her very presence forced the orphanage to bend to her will. She had become the center of everything, the one who couldn't be ignored, the one whose strange teeth held more than just physical power. No one knew how much longer they could hide the truth. They couldn't understand what was happening, but they knew it was only just beginning. What had they unleashed on this quiet, forgotten orphanage? As the years passed, the winters in Hesse grew colder, and the girl's transformation only deepened. Every winter solstice, her teeth grew longer, more intricate, almost like the growth rings on an ancient tree, each set of teeth marking another layer of time, another year of the strange experiment. Frau Biedermann couldn't ignore the signs. The child's teeth were no longer a curiosity. They were a symbol of something far darker, far more sinister. And she wasn't the only one who noticed. Whispers began to spread throughout the orphanage, though they were never spoken aloud. It was the kind of talk that could get you silenced if you weren't careful. The children started asking questions about the child's origins, questions about her transformation. But it wasn't just the children. The staff, those who had worked at the orphanage for years, started to change too. Dr. Hennig, the physician who visited once a month, became more secretive, his visits lasting longer and longer. His eyes grew darker, more intense. The other staff members noticed his furtive glances toward the girl whenever he thought no one was looking. One evening, Frau Biedermann found herself alone in the cold, musty hallways of the orphanage. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the silence inside was stifling. But there, in the shadows of the dimly lit corridor, she heard it, a low, guttural whisper, almost imperceptible. It was coming from the small office at the back of the orphanage. Frau Biedermann's heart pounded in her chest. She stepped closer, her steps muffled by the thick layers of dust on the floor. She had never dared to investigate before, but tonight, something called her to that room. An instinct, perhaps, or a terrible need to understand what was happening. She peered through the cracked door. Inside, Dr. Hennig stood at a table covered in papers and strange diagrams. Drawings of the human skull, pages filled with mathematical equations, symbols she didn't understand. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted a pair of spectacles, his eyes scanning the documents with a fevered intensity. Then, she saw it. Her breath caught in her throat. On the table lay a large journal, open to a page where a series of sketches depicted the very same child she had been watching all these years. The child with the growing teeth, the strange, unexplainable child. Frau Biedermann barely held back the urge to gasp. The sketches were eerily accurate, drawn with precise detail. The teeth, the shape of the girl's face, her body. All of it was there, laid out as though Dr. Hennig had been studying her like a specimen in a lab. Suddenly, a voice, soft but clear, came from behind her. "You shouldn't be here, Frau Biedermann." She turned sharply, her blood running cold. Dr. Hennig stood in the doorway, his face shadowed in the dim light. His eyes were wide, filled with an unsettling mix of fear and urgency. "You've seen too much," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. No idea what she truly is." Frau Biedermann opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She was paralyzed by the truth, or at least the beginnings of it. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What are you doing to her?" Dr. Hennig's gaze softened, almost sadly. He took a step closer, his hands trembling. "She's part of something much larger than we could ever imagine. The experiment, it's not just about the teeth. It's about understanding the nature of the human body, the potential for transformation." He paused, as if weighing the decision to continue. "She's a key," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "A key to something ancient, something lost to time. What we're doing here, we're trying to bring it back." The words hung in the air like a dark omen, and for the first time, Frau Biedermann felt the full weight of the nightmare they had all been living. This was no ordinary orphanage. This was a place where the boundaries of life and death, science and magic, had blurred beyond recognition. And that little girl, her strange, impossible teeth, was at the heart of it all. What was the true purpose of the Hesse experiment? And what would become of the orphan now? The answers were slipping further and further from reach, and Frau Biedermann felt herself losing control of everything she thought she knew. The more Frau Biedermann uncovered, the more she realized that the scope of the experiment extended far beyond her understanding, or the understanding of anyone in the town. The whispers had only just begun, but the truth was darker than she could ever have imagined. The experiment, it seemed, had not just been conducted by the few people in the orphanage. There were others far more powerful operating from the shadows. Dr. Hennig's cryptic words had been the first clue, but as time passed, Frau Biedermann began to notice other strange things. The town of Wiesbaden, which had always been a place of peace, was beginning to change. People became more anxious, more fearful. The children at the orphanage no longer talked about their dreams. Dreams of a cold, unfamiliar place, of figures with hidden faces who watched them from afar. Some of the children had begun to show symptoms that frightened even the staff. Strange markings on their skin, disjointed movements, and vacant stares. One evening, as a particularly harsh snowstorm swept through the town, Frau Biedermann's suspicions reached their peak. The orphanage was completely isolated, cut off from the outside world, and yet, she could sense the presence of unseen eyes. It wasn't just the children she needed to worry about anymore. It was the unknown forces that had been watching them all along. Late one night, after the children had been put to bed, Frau Biedermann made a decision. She had to leave the orphanage and find out who was truly behind the experiment. Her heart raced as she slipped through the back door, the cold biting at her skin. The streets of Wiesbaden were empty, the snow drifting in eerie silence. She moved quickly, her breath clouding in the air, her mind set on one destination, the old library, where she hoped to find answers. The library was vast, its towering shelves filled with forgotten knowledge. It had long been a place of mystery, a sanctuary for scholars and curious minds. But tonight, the building felt even more foreboding. Frau Biedermann walked down the long, dimly lit aisles, searching for anything that might shed light on the secretive organization behind the experiment. In a dusty corner of the library, hidden behind rows of old manuscripts, she found it. A set of journals, bound in cracked leather. The handwriting inside was familiar, and her blood ran cold as she recognized Dr. Hennig's notes. These weren't just medical records. These were detailed accounts of the child's development, but they also contained something else: names, dates, locations that all pointed to one thing. A network of powerful individuals spread across Europe who had been conducting experiments like this for decades. The Hesse experiment was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, one that stretched back centuries. These individuals, scientists, politicians, even royalty, had all been involved in this dark project, seeking to unlock the secrets of human evolution and the limits of life itself. But they weren't just after knowledge. No, they were after power, power that came from controlling something as unimaginable as the human body's potential to transform. As Frau Biedermann pored over the pages, a sense of dread settled over her. The experiment wasn't just an isolated event in the town of Wiesbaden. It was part of something far more sinister, something that had been growing in the shadows for generations. The child was no longer just a victim of this experiment. She was a pawn in a game played by the most dangerous forces in Europe. Who were these people? And what did they want from the child? What was their true endgame? The questions burned in her mind, but as she turned the pages, one line stood out. A name she recognized. The Countess von der Haus. It wasn't just any name. The Countess was one of the most powerful women in Europe, known for her extensive connections and influence. She had long been rumored to have a fascination with dark sciences and the occult. But Frau Biedermann hadn't connected her to the Hesse experiment, until now. The Countess von der Haus had been watching the orphanage from afar, controlling the experiment from the shadows. She had orchestrated the arrival of the child, and she had been pulling the strings ever since. Frau Biedermann's heart raced. She had found the mastermind. But what now? She had no proof, no way to expose the Countess without endangering herself and the children at the orphanage. The storm outside had grown fiercer, but the storm inside her mind was even worse. The truth had been uncovered, but it was only the beginning. What would happen when the Countess learned that someone had discovered her secret? With the discovery of the Countess Vonderhaus and her secretive role in the Hesse Experiment, a dark reality began to settle over the orphanage. The walls of the old building no longer seemed just like a place of refuge. They were now a prison, a holding pen for something much more sinister. The orphan with the ever-growing teeth was no longer simply a curiosity to the staff and children. She was a symbol of a twisted, horrifying transformation. As the next winter solstice approached, the tension in the orphanage grew unbearable. The staff had grown more distant, avoiding the girl at all costs. The children, who had once been fascinated by her strange appearance, now regarded her with fear and suspicion. Some of them even whispered that she was cursed, that her very existence was a sign of something dark coming for them all. Frau Biedermann, now fully aware of the web of deceit that surrounded her, couldn't shake the feeling that the child was being controlled. The teeth were not just a sign of some abnormality. They were a key to the power that the Countess and her network sought. The orphan's transformation had become something more than a physical anomaly. It had become a ritual, one that grew more terrifying with every passing year. The night of the solstice arrived, and with it, the sense of impending doom. Frau Biedermann stood in the shadows of the orphanage's main hall, watching the child. The girl had grown quieter with each passing year, her once vibrant eyes now cold and distant. But tonight was different. Tonight there was something in the air, something electric. As the clock struck midnight, the familiar cracking sound filled the room, followed by the soft, chilling click of the teeth pushing through her gums. But this time it was different. The transformation was faster, more violent. The child's mouth opened wider than ever before, and the teeth, sharp, jagged, and growing, seemed to take on a life of their own. It wasn't just that they were growing longer. They were changing, twisting, shifting, becoming something otherworldly. Frau Biedermann's breath caught in her throat as she watched, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the low, guttural growl emanating from the child's throat, something deep and primal. Her skin stretched taut over the growing teeth, her eyes rolling back as if she were in some sort of trance. The children, too, had gathered in the hall, drawn by the sound. They stood in the doorway, their faces pale with fear, their mouths agape. They had seen the teeth before, but this was different. This was more than just the growing teeth. It was something far darker, something more terrifying than any of them had imagined. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the transformation stopped. The girl's mouth closed, and she slumped back into the corner of the room, as though nothing had happened. But the staff, Frau Biedermann included, couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary child. What had just occurred? What had they all witnessed? The change in the girl had gone beyond the physical. Something had awoken inside her. A power that no one could understand. A power that was growing stronger with each passing year. The orphanage was no longer a safe place. The child had become something else entirely, a tool, a weapon in a much larger game. The Countess Vonderhaus was watching, of that Frau Biedermann was certain. And now, with the girl's transformation reaching new heights, there was no turning back. The orphanage was at the center of something far larger than anyone could comprehend. The teeth were no longer just a sign of growth. They were a symbol of the power that was being unlocked, piece by piece, with each winter solstice. But the question remained, what would happen when the experiment reached its final stage? What would happen when the child, with her growing teeth and her unnatural abilities, became something the world couldn't ignore? And who would be left to stop it? By the time the winter of 1851 arrived, the orphan's transformation had become undeniable. It wasn't just the teeth anymore. Though they had grown longer, sharper, and even more sinister in appearance, but her entire body had begun to change. The girl's once pale skin had taken on a ghastly, almost translucent hue, and her bones seemed to stretch unnaturally, elongating with a rigidity that made it seem as though she were built for something other than the human world. Frostbite crept in every winter, but for this child, it wasn't just the cold that gnawed at her. The very cold of Hesse had become a part of her, a strange force that worked its way through her veins, almost as though it were imprinted on her very being. She had grown immune to it in a way that terrified everyone who watched her. Her teeth, too, had taken on new qualities. No longer merely the size of a small animal's fangs, they had become tools of an eerie, predatory nature, long, jagged, and sharp enough to tear through almost anything. The children of the orphanage no longer dared to approach her, and the staff could barely look her in the eye. What had once been a child's innocent form was now something monstrous. But it was the physical toll on the orphan that was truly chilling. Her transformation didn't stop at the teeth. The girl's body seemed to reshape itself every winter, becoming taller and more gaunt with each passing year. Her spine seemed to grow unnaturally long, causing her movements to become stiff and jerky. Her once soft hands were now like skeletal claws, fingers thin and sharp, her nails like talons that scraped across the floor when she moved. And her eyes, those eyes, had turned an unsettling shade of icy blue, cold and unblinking. The life that had once shone in them was gone. Instead, there was only an emptiness that filled them, an abyss that seemed to draw in everything around her. She no longer looked like a human at all. Each winter solstice, the orphan's transformation would reach a new, horrific level. But it wasn't just her appearance that had changed. It was the energy around her. The orphan's mere presence in the room could freeze the air. The temperature would plummet, and the frost would creep up the walls, clinging to the old wood like an unrelenting force. The children began to speak of strange happenings. Some whispered that the orphan could control the cold, that the frost was a manifestation of her growing power. It was difficult to tell where the truth ended and the rumors began, but one thing was clear. No one was safe anymore. Even Frau Biedermann, who had seen so much of the girl's transformation, couldn't help but feel a deep fear when she was near. One particularly frigid evening, a scream echoed through the orphanage halls. Frau Biedermann rushed toward the source, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached the dormitory just in time to see a young girl, no older than 10, clutching her arm in pain. Her skin was raw and blistered, frostbite gnawing at her small fingers. The girl's face was pale with terror, her eyes wide as she stammered in fear. "I saw her. I saw her. Standing in the corner," the girl cried, her voice shaking. She was glowing. Her teeth were. Frau Biedermann knelt beside the girl, trying to calm her, but the child's words were like a knife to her heart. The girl had seen the orphan, but it wasn't the girl they all once knew. The child who had been abandoned on the orphanage's doorstep had become something far worse. With every winter, the girl grew more powerful, her presence becoming more dangerous. The other children began to isolate themselves from her. But the damage had already been done. Those who dared to get too close would feel the chill in their bones, a cold that went deeper than the skin. Frau Biedermann, despite her fear, knew she had to act. She couldn't allow the experiment to continue. But she also knew that stopping it would be impossible now. The orphan had become something beyond anyone's control, something far more than they had ever bargained for. The frost in the orphanage had become a symbol of her power, a power that seemed to grow stronger with each passing year. And with it, the fear grew. It was only a matter of time before the world would see the true extent of what had been unleashed. But what would happen when the child's transformation reached its final stage? What kind of creature would she become? And who would be left to stop it? The question lingered in the frozen air, unanswered and terrifying. As the years dragged on, the strange happenings at the orphanage began to spill over into the town of Wiesbaden. The whispers that had started as quiet murmurs in dark corners were now open discussions, fueled by fear, uncertainty, and a growing sense of unease. The once peaceful town had become a place where every face carried a secret, and every shadow seemed to hold a story of dread. The orphan, once a curiosity to the townspeople, had become an enigma, a ghost story whispered to children at night. The townspeople who had heard rumors about the girl's transformations began to tell their own versions of the tale. Some claimed that the orphan was a miraculous child, blessed with strange gifts that went beyond the human realm. They said that she had the power to heal, that her icy touch could cure illnesses no doctor could, and that her presence brought calm to the troubled. But others, those who feared the growing power of the orphan, told a darker story. They spoke of a child possessed, a creature born of dark magic, whose very existence was a curse. There were rumors that she could freeze time, that she could control the weather, and that her teeth were not just for feeding, but for tearing apart the world itself. The truth, as it often is, lay somewhere between the stories. But neither side of the town seemed able or willing to acknowledge it fully. The town's leaders, including the mayor and the town council, met in secret to discuss the growing threat. They knew that something was wrong, but they couldn't bring themselves to confront it. They feared the consequences of what might happen if they did. After all, what could they do against a force that seemed beyond their understanding? The orphanage was officially still a place of care for abandoned children, but in the eyes of many, it had become a prison. It wasn't just the orphan who was under suspicion, it was all the children housed within its walls. People began to avoid the orphanage entirely, crossing the street whenever they passed by. The children inside were no longer seen as innocent victims. They were viewed as accomplices, carriers of the curse that had taken hold of the town. Frau Biedermann, once a trusted member of the community, became an outcast. Her role in the orphanage had always been viewed with a quiet reverence. But now, the rumors about her connection to the orphan were impossible to ignore. Some said that she had made a pact with the dark forces controlling the child, that she was complicit in the experiment. Others whispered that she was trying to protect the girl, hiding her true intentions from the town. No one knew whom to trust anymore. The fear was palpable, suffocating the life out of the town. Yet, despite the rumors and lies, no one truly knew what to believe. Some people even left Wiesbaden altogether, unable to live with the uncertainty, while others stayed and tried to forget. But one thing was clear. The orphan had become a symbol of something far greater than a mere child. She was a symbol of a dark force that had taken root in their town, a force that no one could escape. But what of the girl herself? Did she understand the rumors that swirled around her? Could she feel the hatred, the fear, and the growing distrust? The child had once been just a simple orphan, abandoned and alone. But now she was something much more. She had become the center of a storm, and every day, that storm grew stronger. And as the town continued to turn its back on her, the girl, with her sharp teeth and her unnerving presence, began to grow bolder. The power that had lain dormant within her was now beginning to stir, ready to break free. The town of Wiesbaden had no idea just how close they were to the storm's eye. The years of fear, secrecy, and dread culminated in a chilling, inevitable moment. The orphanage, the heart of the Hesse Experiment, was abandoned. The once quiet and forgotten building now stood as a decaying monument to human curiosity and its consequences. The staff, the children, and Frau Biedermann had all vanished, leaving only the ghosts of their past behind. The townspeople had been waiting for this day, though none of them had anticipated the true horror of what it meant. There were rumors of a great fire that consumed the orphanage, a fire so intense it could not have been caused by accident. Some whispered that the girl, the orphan with the teeth, had finally lost control. Others believed that the Countess von der Haus, sensing the experiment slipping from her grasp, had ordered its end, burning the orphanage to the ground to cover her tracks. But no one truly knew. By the time the flames had died down, there was nothing left but charred ruins, and the truth was lost in the ashes. The orphanage, the site of so many dark experiments and twisted growths, had become a hollow shell of its former self. Its walls, which had once held so many secrets, now stood silent. The children of Wiesbaden, those who had once whispered in fear of the orphan and her growing power, now spoke of her only in hushed tones, as if acknowledging her existence would call down some curse upon them. And Frau Biedermann? She too had disappeared, her name lost to the annals of time. Some said she had tried to protect the girl, others that she had fled when the experiment began to fall apart. No one knew for certain. Yet, despite the orphanage's destruction, the legend of the girl with the growing teeth continued to linger in the town. Her presence, her legacy, could not be erased so easily. The children who had lived there were scattered, but they carried with them memories of a power they could not understand. Memories of a child who had never fully been human, who had never belonged to the world she was born into. The Countess von der Haus, too, disappeared from history. Her name faded from the records, and her connection to the Hesse Experiment was buried under layers of lies and silence. But her influence had not disappeared entirely. Those who had been part of the experiment, those who had watched from the shadows, were still out there. They knew the truth and they were waiting. The experiment was unfinished, its goals unfulfilled, its dark promise left hanging in the air. It was clear that the power the orphan had demonstrated, her ability to transform, to manipulate the very essence of life, was just the beginning. The legacy of the Hesse Experiment was far from over. And as the years passed, those who had been involved in the experiment slowly began to resurface. Whispers of new experiments, of new children, began to reach the ears of those who remembered the orphan. The Countess may have been gone, but the dark network of powerful individuals she had once controlled still existed. The orphan's story was far from finished. It was only the beginning of a much larger tale, one that would stretch far beyond the borders of Wiesbaden, one that would reach into the shadows of Europe itself. The teeth, the transformation, the terrible power, these were just the first steps. For some, the question still lingered. Had the orphan truly disappeared, or was she out there, somewhere, continuing the legacy of the Hesse Experiment, waiting for the next winter solstice to bring forth the next stage of her terrifying evolution? The experiment was far from over. It had only just begun. It was winter again, the coldest on record. The solstice arrived like clockwork, and with it, the whispers returned. The town of Wiesbaden had long since forgotten the truth behind the orphanage, the truth of the girl who grew teeth every winter, but the truth had never truly left. In the silent, frozen woods outside the town, there were still those who remembered, and they were waiting. As the town slept beneath a blanket of snow, the shadows seemed to come alive once more. No one had seen the orphan for decades, and the orphanage had been reduced to rubble. Yet, somewhere deep in the ruins, something stirred. The cold winds that blew across the charred remains of the building were not just the forces of nature. They were something else, something unnatural. The frost, which had once marked the girl's presence, now seemed to cover the land itself, as though her power had seeped into the very earth. In the dead of night, a figure appeared in the town streets, moving silently, almost imperceptibly, through the snow. Her presence was both familiar and foreign. It was her, the orphan, now no longer a child but a woman. Her eyes were the same icy blue, her skin still pale, and her teeth, sharp and gleaming, were now fully grown, longer, more terrifying than ever. She moved with purpose, her steps calculated, as though the years of waiting had finally come to an end. The people who had once feared her, who had whispered her name in fear, now felt the same icy chill that had haunted them all those years ago. The orphan had returned, but this time, she was different. The transformation that had begun so many winters ago had reached its final stage. Her teeth, her body, her very being had become a weapon, a vessel of power that no one could understand. The Hesse Experiment, which had once been hidden in the shadows, had reached its terrifying conclusion. And now the world would know. The Countess von der Haus may have vanished from the pages of history, but her legacy lived on in the orphan. The dark experiment was not over, it had only evolved. The orphan was the key, and she had come to claim her place in a world that had long ignored the power she represented. The final winter was not just about the girl's transformation. It was about the culmination of the Hesse Experiment's true purpose. To awaken a force that could transcend human limitations, a force that could control life, death, and everything in between. The orphan had become the embodiment of that force, and she would not be silenced any longer. As the townspeople awoke to the chilling dawn, they saw her standing in the center of Wiesbaden, her eyes cold and unblinking, her teeth glistening in the pale morning light. The storm had come, and with it, a new era was born. The orphan, now a woman of power and purpose, had returned to complete what had been started all those years ago. The Hesse experiment had not been an isolated incident. It had been a glimpse of something far greater, something that would shape the future of humanity. And as the last remnants of the town's history burned away in the glow of the winter's fire, the truth was clear. The orphan's journey had only just begun. The world would soon know what she had become, and what she was capable of. The Hesse experiment was not finished. It had merely entered its final, most terrifying phase.